December 19, 1997. Westwood Village, Los Angeles, 10:47 p.m. Flashbulbs crack like distant fireworks, the barricades tremble as thousands scream a single name. Leo. Black SUVs crawl forward inches at a time, security leans into the crowd, studio executives stand stiff in tailored coats smiling for cameras they've already mastered, and then he steps out. Leonardo DiCaprio, 23 years old, face lit by camera strobes, smile calibrated, wave timed, the star of Titanic. The noise is not cheering anymore, it's hysteria. You can almost feel the heat from the crowd pressing in, the kind of fame that doesn't lift you, it traps you, it sticks to your skin, it brands you. Inside the theater, executives whisper projections, record-breaking numbers, global domination, cultural takeover. Outside, teenage fans cry as if they've witnessed something religious. But beneath the tuxedo and polished composure, something else is forming. A realization. This isn't just success, it's consumption. Over the next 12 months, Titanic becomes a global phenomenon. Box office records shatter, magazine covers multiply, talk shows compete for bookings. DiCaprio's face becomes a product printed, packaged, sold. And Hollywood begins doing what it always does with young male heartthrobs. It narrows them. Scripts flood in, romantic leads, safe blockbusters, glossy studio vehicles designed to stretch the moment. Offers that would guarantee tens of millions and perpetual visibility. Stay visible, stay marketable, stay adored. The machine hums with a single message: repeat this. But here's what most people didn't see. Behind closed doors, DiCaprio wasn't celebrating momentum, he was studying it, watching how quickly admiration turns into typecasting, how studios once grateful begin planning your expiration date the moment you peak. The early 2000s were unforgiving to actors who burned too brightly too fast. Hollywood had a pattern: elevate, exploit, replace. And DiCaprio could see it happening in real time. The Leo Mania headlines felt less like praise and more like confinement. Late-night hosts reduced him to a heartthrob punchline. Industry veterans quietly questioned whether he could survive beyond the frenzy. Teen idol. That label can follow you like a shadow. You can almost imagine him in those months after the premiere, alone in a quiet room, scripts stacked high, publicists strategizing, agents pushing momentum. This is the moment most actors double down. He didn't. Instead of chasing saturation, DiCaprio began to withdraw, fewer public appearances, longer gaps between projects, a subtle refusal to capitalize immediately on the frenzy. It looked risky. Because in Hollywood, absence is often interpreted as decline. Studios don't reward silence, they reward constant output. And yet, somewhere between the chaos of Titanic and the early 2000s, a quiet internal line was drawn. If he stayed on the path of mass adoration, he would be locked into it. If he paused, recalibrated, chose differently, he might lose momentum. Or he might gain something more powerful. Control. The pressure was enormous. At 23, the industry was offering him immortality on its terms. But immortality on someone else's terms is still a cage. The world saw a young man at the top of Hollywood. What they didn't see was the first crack in the spotlight, the night the applause began to feel like a countdown clock. And the decision forming in the silence. Los Angeles, early 2000. A glass-walled conference room overlooking Wilshire Boulevard. Development executives flip through headshots and market data. Charts are projected on the wall, demographic breakdowns, overseas grosses, brand alignment forecasts. His name is circled in red marker. Still bankable, someone says. But can he open something without the hysteria? Another counters. The tone has shifted. Just 2 years earlier, DiCaprio was untouchable. Now he was being evaluated like a stock, volatile, emotionally driven, heavily tied to a single cultural moment. The industry had already begun asking the quiet question. Was he an actor or an era? That distinction matters in Hollywood. Because eras fade. Actors endure. After Titanic, DiCaprio could have chosen the safest path possible: romantic dramas, large-scale blockbusters, predictable franchise territory. The kind of roles that sustain celebrity even if they dilute craft. Instead, he began leaning into something less obvious. Complexity. In 2000, he starred in The Beach, a film that was darker, more introspective, less universally charming than what audiences expected. The reaction was mixed. Critics debated, the cultural frenzy cooled. And that cooling was intentional. You can almost feel the psychological tension of that choice, to willingly step into something divisive when the world wants you uncomplicated, to risk cooling off when heat is your currency. This is where restraint becomes strategy. Hollywood thrives on momentum. Agents push for back-to-back projects to maintain heat. Publicists schedule visibility cycles, premieres, interviews, award circuits. DiCaprio disrupted that rhythm. He began spacing projects further apart. He declined roles that would have reinforced the heartthrob image. He quietly avoided overexposure in tabloids and franchise deals. To the public, it looked like inconsistency. To the industry, it was confusing. And confusion is dangerous in a system built on predictability. But psychologically, something deeper was happening. DiCaprio wasn't just selecting roles, he was recalibrating perception. If audiences only see you as desirable, they struggle to see you as dangerous. If executives only see you as profitable, they struggle to see you as powerful. So he began seeking roles that introduced moral ambiguity, internal conflict, emotional instability. He was slowly dismantling the image that had made him famous. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. You can almost imagine the internal conversations, the hesitation before saying no to a major offer, the understanding that stepping away from saturation could be misinterpreted as decline. There's a unique psychological pressure in knowing that if you disappear too long, the industry might move on. And it often does. But hear what most rising stars underestimate. Constant presence can shrink authority. Scarcity expands it. As the early 2000s unfolded, DiCaprio wasn't fatting, he was repositioning. He began aligning with filmmakers known for intensity and artistic credibility rather than mass hysteria. He wasn't chasing attention anymore. He was chasing weight. And weight moves differently in Hollywood. By 2002, he would make a decision that subtly shifted the axis of his career, a collaboration that industry insiders didn't initially view as revolutionary. But it would become the foundation of a two-decade reinvention. Because while the world still remembered Jack Dawson, DiCaprio was preparing to bury him. And the partnership that would allow that burial was already forming behind studio doors. Gangs of New York set, Rome, 2001. The air smells like sawdust and hot lights. Massive wooden facades recreate 19th century Manhattan. Extras in period costumes shuffle between takes. The production is chaotic, expensive, ambitious. And at the center of it stands Martin Scorsese, already a living legend. DiCaprio watches him carefully. Not as a fan. As a student. This wasn't just another role, it was an apprenticeship. At the time, the pairing didn't look inevitable. Scorsese was associated with De Niro, with an earlier generation of raw, dangerous masculinity. DiCaprio in the public imagination was still framed by romance and hysteria. But this collaboration was deliberate. Scorsese offered something no blockbuster could, artistic gravity. On set, DiCaprio wasn't the untouchable icon from a billion-dollar film. He was a young actor being pushed, harder takes, deeper emotional excavation, historical immersion, long conversations about character psychology, moral decay, obsession. You can almost feel the shift happening. He wasn't performing charm anymore. He was performing fracture. The industry noticed, but cautiously. Gangs of New York received attention, awards buzz, debate. It wasn't a clean victory, but it marked a transition. DiCaprio had stepped into darker territory without losing audience interest. And then came the real recalibration. The Aviator. Howard Hughes was not a safe choice. He was obsessive, paranoid, brilliant, unraveling, a far cry from the uncomplicated hero archetype studios love to mass-produce. DiCaprio leaned into the instability, The hand-washing rituals, the isolation, the descent. This wasn't just performance, it was image demolition. He was signaling something to Hollywood. I am not here to be adored. I am here to be studied. That's a dangerous shift because it trades easy applause for critical scrutiny, but scrutiny, when survived, builds authority. Psychologically, this is the moment control begins to reemerge. By attaching himself to Scorsese repeatedly, DiCaprio wasn't just choosing roles, he was building a creative alliance that communicated seriousness. Hollywood respects consistency in partnerships. It implies loyalty, depth, shared vision. But it also implies power. Because when a director of Scorsese's stature repeatedly chooses the same actor, it reframes that actor's status. Not as a product, as a collaborator. You can almost sense the internal calm replacing the earlier frenzy. The screaming crowds were fatting from headlines. In their place were awards discussions, craft interviews, debates about performance nuance. The temperature had changed. Cooler, heavier. Intentional. And here's the subtle industry insight most viewers never consider. When an actor becomes selective enough to slow down production cycles, studios begin adjusting around them. Financing waits, directors schedule around availability, scripts are developed with them in mind. Absence begins to generate leverage. By the mid-2000s, DiCaprio was no longer chasing momentum. Momentum was waiting for him. But this strategy came with risk, because the longer you stretch between projects, the higher the expectations climb. Each film becomes an event, each performance is dissected. One misstep could confirm every early doubt. And in 2006, that pressure would intensify, not with one film but two. A test of whether this quiet reinvention could truly hold. October 6, 2006. New York City, midnight premiere lights flicker across wet pavement. Two films same year. The Departed. Blood Diamond. This wasn't saturation, it was calibration. For nearly a decade after Titanic, DiCaprio had been slowly widening the distance between himself and the version of him the public first met. Now the industry was about to measure whether that distance held. Inside the Ziegfeld Theater, critics scribbled notes during The Departed. Undercover cop, fractured loyalty, anxiety simmering beneath every glance. His performance wasn't charming, it was unraveling. Sweat-soaked, paranoid, sharp-edged. Weeks later in Blood Diamond, he disappeared into a morally conflicted mercenary. Rough accent, hardened exterior, internal war flickering behind the eyes. Two roles, both tense, both morally complex, neither designed for easy affection. This was no longer a transition. It was a declaration. And here, where the psychology becomes fascinating. By spacing projects out, by choosing weight over visibility, DiCaprio had unintentionally created a phenomenon, expectation gravity. When he appeared, it felt significant. Scarcity had turned him into an event. Studios noticed, critics recalibrated, audiences leaned forward differently. The conversation shifted from "is he still relevant?" to "what is he building?" Because now a pattern was visible. Intense directors, moral ambiguity, psychological strain, long development timelines. He wasn't hopping between trends, he was constructing a lane. You can almost feel the control settling in. The earlier noise, the screaming crowds, the tabloid fixation had been replaced by something quieter but far more durable. Respect. But respect in Hollywood is not permanent, it's conditional, it must be reinforced. And this is where many actors stumble. Once credibility is regained, they rush back into commercial comfort, franchises, overexposure, brand partnerships that dilute mystique. DiCaprio didn't. He maintained distance. No superhero universe. No endless sequels. No overexposed social media presence. He allowed the work to carry visibility. This restraint is counterintuitive in a system that rewards omnipresence. But psychologically, it does something powerful. It shifts perceived value from personality to performance. You aren't watching him because he's everywhere. You're watching because he is. By 2010, with Inception, the strategy reached another level. Christopher Nolan's labyrinthine thriller demanded intellectual engagement from audiences. DiCaprio anchored it not as a glossy action star but as a grieving, guilt-ridden protagonist trapped inside his own mind. Even in a blockbuster, the emotional core was fracture. The pattern held. And here's the quiet industry recalibration that happened behind the scenes. He was no longer being offered roles. Films were being assembled around him. Financing models factored in his selective participation. Directors sought him not for hype but for credibility. Awards circuits began anticipating him. Control had shifted. Not through dominance, through discipline. But the ultimate test of this strategy wasn't box office, it wasn't critical acclaim. It was endurance. Because true reinvention isn't proven in 5 years. It's proven in 20. And in 2016. Nearly 2 decades after that night outside the Titanic premiere, the long game would crystallize in a way few predicted. Not as a comeback, but as confirmation. February 28, 2016. Dolby Theatre, Hollywood, 11:43 p.m. The envelope trembles slightly in the presenter's hand. And the Oscar goes to Leonardo DiCaprio. For a split second the room inhales. Not because it's shocking. Because it feels inevitable. As he walks to the stage, the applause isn't hysterical like it was in 1997. It's measured, respectful, almost relieved. Industry veterans rise to their feet, directors nod, fellow actors clap with a kind of knowing acknowledgement. This wasn't a win for a single performance in The Revenant. It was a verdict on a strategy. Nearly 20 years earlier, he stood at the height of global obsession. He could have remained there, cycling through safe hits, maximizing visibility, becoming permanently tied to a single era. Instead, he chose patience. You can almost trace the invisible architecture now, the spacing between films, the repeated collaborations with auteurs, the refusal to overshare, the careful avoidance of brand dilution. Each decision built something intangible: authority. By the time The Revenant arrived, brutal, sparse, physically punishing, the narrative around him had fully shifted. He wasn't chasing awards, he was synonymous with commitment, with endurance. The Oscar wasn't transformation. It was recognition of transformation already complete. Psychologically, this is the power of delayed gratification in a system addicted to immediacy. Most rising stars fear slowing down because they equate silence with irrelevance. But DiCaprio proved something different. Silence can be leverage. When you are not constantly available, your presence regains weight. When you refuse overexposure, mystique compounds. When you align with depth rather than trend, you become insulated from trend. Hollywood recalibrates around scarcity. And here's the deeper industry truth, the one rarely spoken aloud. Power in Hollywood doesn't come from being everywhere. It comes from being necessary. By the mid-2010s, DiCaprio wasn't just a leading man, he was a stabilizing force in prestige cinema. Directors built projects knowing his involvement signaled seriousness. Investors trusted the long development cycles because his name implied longevity. He had shifted from commodity to cornerstone. That shift doesn't happen accidentally. It requires resisting ego, turning down easy money, accepting quieter years, enduring speculation about decline without reacting publicly. It requires confidence in the unseen arc. And perhaps the most remarkable part, he never announced this strategy, never framed it as reinvention, never publicly declared a reset. It happened in the gaps. In the projects he declined. In the years he stayed quiet. In the partnerships he repeated. The audience often interprets absence as uncertainty. But in this case, absence was design. Tonight, when the applause settles and the cameras stop flashing, something subtle becomes clear. The young man once framed as a fleeting heartthrob has outlasted the narrative that tried to contain him. And he did it not by fighting the machine loudly, but by stepping just far enough away from it to redraw the terms.